Hello, everybody. I think it's time to start. Welcome to our panel discussion on bringing the COVID-19 pandemic under control. I changed the word epidemic to pandemic, but that just reflects the real data currently with 43 million recorded cases and 1.15 million deaths globally. I would think that the SARS-CoV-2 is indeed a real health crisis that affects all of us from south to north, from east to west on this globe, high-income countries equally to low and middle-income countries. So this is a real issue, and that is the issue we will focus on today in our discussion round. The list of panelists is extremely eminent, and I'm very glad that you all, and grateful that you all accepted to participate. Some had to get up early, for others it may be very late, but that is how it is now. And what we really want to do is we want to discuss all the questions that are of utmost importance to us with the COVID-19 crisis. And we wanted to look at the drawbacks and the accomplishments, and finally really go into our future perspective on this and all the other issues that bother us a lot. My name is Stefan Kaufman. I'm the chair, as you already realized, of this panel discussion. I'm the founding director of the Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology here in Berlin, where I'm now a director emeritus, but I lead an emeritus group at another Max Planck Institute in Göttingen. For the World Health Summit, I serve as co-chair of the scientific committee, and I'm very, very honored that we have this top-notch group of panelists here, and I thank you once more for joining us, highly appreciated. Now, these are the rules. We will have 6 presentations, and each of you will have about 7 minutes to make your major points and set the stage. If there are really urgent comments or questions from the audience, speakers may answer directly in typing answers, I guess, but we really want to move the real discussion at the end of our panel discussion. So therefore, I will only have questions in between if they are very, very urgent and very direct. Otherwise, let's look forward to the final panel discussion. So I would suggest we start very immediately with the 6 presentations, and I want to introduce our 6 expert panelists now very shortly. Our first speaker is Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. She's chief scientist at the World Health Organization. Hello, Soumya. Then Dr. Victor Zhao, president of the National Academy of Medicine and member of the very important Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. And I'm really eager to hear what you will say, Victor. Next one, Dr. Depal Liu from the Chinese Academy of Engineering and co-chair of the Inter-Academy Partners for Health in China. Then we move on to a representative from private industry, Dr. Ruxandra Draghia-Akli, the global head of global public health, R&D at Johnson & Johnson, followed by Dr. Richard Hatchett, Chief Executive Officer of CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And then last not least, Dr. Trevor Mundell, President of the Global Health Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So let's start with Dr. Soumya Swaminathan from WHO. She brings with her 30 years of experience in clinical care and research. She has worked throughout her career to translate research into impactful programs, to translation, first in India, when she worked mostly on TB, that's where I know you, Soumya, and then increasingly with international organizations, notably now with the WHO. Your topic is science and the pandemic, very, very urgent, and I guess it will be somehow from the perspective of the WHO. So the stage is yours. Soumya.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello to all the other co-panelists. I think obviously this year the World Health Summit is meeting under very different circumstances, and I congratulate you for carrying on in this with these panels and trying to make the most of it, because I think it is important that we come together to discuss some of these issues. So I would like to, in the next few minutes, just go back to January 1st, when we had the confirmation of the first the outbreak of the atypical pneumonia in Wuhan. WHO activated the incident management team, which is basically the team that's put together because of the international health regulations that has focal points from all the member states, countries of WHO, to alert them as to this happening in Wuhan. And by January 5th, the first disease outbreak news, the Dawn report, we call it, was produced. And as early as January 14th, we had the technical guidance for the first set of issues going out. Even before we knew a lot about this virus, we already started putting out laboratory protocols for diagnostic testing, for management of patients, clinical management, as well as for contact tracing and public health measures. Now, one thing I would like to say right at the beginning, since we are talking about science and the fact that from the very beginning, we recognized the fact that it was going to be science, technology, innovation that is going to serve us well. And I think some of the things that one had prepared for over the last few years actually came in very useful. The publication of the whole genome sequences of the first few viral sequences of the novel coronavirus from China on January 10th or 11th, they submit on the 10th, on the 11th, it was publicly available. I think that was a game changer, basically, because it allowed not only the development of diagnostics immediately, within 48 hours. In fact, we had Charité right there in Berlin, Christian Drosten and his team, who produced the first protocols for RT-PCR. This went around the world. Many labs were able to set up diagnostics. WHO was able to start procuring reagents and shipping them to countries. And in fact, on the whole of the African continent, there were only two countries, or rather in the Afro part of WHO, there were two countries, Senegal and South Africa, that had capacity at the beginning of this February to do these diagnostic tests. So we had to very quickly pull together training, reagent shipping, and all of that to make it possible. But it all started with the sharing of the genetic sequences. And I hope that that's one of the lessons that we need to learn. I think it's one of the success stories. But if that had not happened at that time in January, then things could have been very different. I think for SARS-1, it took like 8 months or something to figure out what was happening. So we were able to very quickly convene the R&D Blueprint Global Coordinating Mechanism. So the R&D Blueprint was set up after the West Africa Ebola outbreak at the request of member states, who asked WHO to have a framework for undertaking research in these emergency settings, particularly for diseases which do not have a big market pull and for which there's a lack of products. And in fact, CEPI, and Richard will speak to this later, was set up as one of the outcomes, I think, of that, when we realized that there are all of these diseases which can cause these immense amount of human suffering, but for which there is no investment in vaccines, or for that matter, in diagnostics or therapeutics. So the R&D framework has a global coordinating mechanism with members representing many different funding agencies, many different constituencies. There's a scientific advisory group that's chaired by Jeremy Farrar. These groups met by mid-January, and then we met again with a larger group of experts in February and came up with a research roadmap. So again, very early action, identifying the knowledge gaps, setting the research priorities, not just for product development, those were important, diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, but also for things like clinical management, for looking at the animal-human interface, for looking at epidemiology and transmission. And very importantly, two cross-cutting working groups, one on social and behavioral sciences and the other one on ethics, all made up of international, very well representative groups. They started convening virtually once or twice a week coming up with their own, pursuing their own areas of research. And then when we reconvened in July, it was amazing to see the progress that had been made. In fact, we had 1,400 scientists in July talk about progress, talk about what we now know about the virus, but still big gaps in knowledge. And I think the other thing that's been unprecedented this time is a vaccine development. And others are going to speak about that in more detail, so I won't say a lot, except to underline the fact that this is where global collaboration is needed, that preparation beforehand is needed. You don't get things to happen. If CEPI had not existed, I doubt that we would have had the kind of rapid development that we see today. If the R&D blueprint had not existed, we wouldn't have been able to pull together all these working groups that worked on, animal models, on assay development and standardization, and a whole host of other things. The other area that we've innovated this time and tried to do things differently is around the evidence synthesis. And what we've tried to do is really set up a network. We call it an evidence collaborative, including organizations like Cochrane, but many other groups. I think we have something like 85 groups now collaborating. Each of them is really tasked with doing these rapid reviews. And every week we have rapid reviews on practically every topic that has a relevance. And this is how we update our scientific guidance. We've set up a publications review committee, which turns around documents within 48 hours. They don't approve all the documents that come to them. In fact, the rejection rate is about 50%, indicating that we are making sure there's rigor in the process, despite the fact that we're trying to be as fast as possible. And this is how normally we do treatment guidelines. We have a guideline review committee, they meet, it takes several months, guidelines are then made, they go through a GRC. All of that has now been compressed into a matter of a few weeks. So within a few weeks of publication of new clinical trial data, we try to have the guidance out. And we're doing a lot of work now on the normative side with the ACT Accelerator, working with CEPI and Gavi, thinking through things like how would an emergency use authorization for a vaccine be done? When would a licensing or a pre-qualification be done? How should that match up with the policy process, and so on. And I think one other thing I'd like to highlight is the ethics. I think that's been very useful. The bioethics working group that we've pulled together has met and has come up with very good documents on topics ranging from the allocation of scarce resources. So we know that vaccines, for example, are going to be in limited supplies. How do you allocate them? What are the ethical principles? To things like the ethics of contact tracing apps, to the ethics of using artificial intelligence in applications. And these are things, again, we were able to do very quickly because we had pre-existing mechanisms we've done one on human challenge studies. In fact, we have two documents, one looking at the ethics and what would be the ethical framework under which one could undertake human challenge studies for COVID-19, but also we have a more operational guide on actually undertaking human challenge studies. So we're neither promoting nor discouraging people, but just laying out all the elements of what you'd have to think about in order to do ethical and scientifically, excellent human challenge studies. We've seen, the last point I'd like to make, Stefan, is that the impact on essential health services and other diseases has been huge. So while the whole world naturally has been focused on the pandemic and how to minimize deaths and minimize cases, what has happened is a lot of collateral damage on health systems. And this has been much more marked in the low-income countries, though no country has been really spared this. And so we've seen malaria programs suffer, TB programs suffer. There have been drug shortages in the HIV programs, particularly HIV in children, and many other vector-borne diseases could get worse and have gotten worse. I think now health systems are catching up, but again, it shows that you need investments so that health systems are resilient. When faced with a sudden shock, you don't just collapse. You have to deal with the shock and also continue to provide essential health services, and some countries have done it better than others, and we need to learn from them. So maybe I should stop now, and then we can come back to further discussions later.
Well, thank you, Soumya. Very, very, very important introduction, and I think WHO has really made enormous progress from the beginning. There are two questions, but they're very specific. I think we can have them at the end because others may be even better suited for those. But if you want, you can also type in if your answers. Let's come to the and also thanks very much that reminding us of all the other diseases that are ongoing currently, and they shouldn't suffer too much. But I think Trevor will come back to that. Let's come to our next speaker and panelist, Dr. Victor Chao, from the president of the National Academy of Medicine in the US. But you will focus now on the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, where you are a member in, and which monitors global activities aimed at preventing, I would now provocatively say, what has happened. We would have liked to take that one step further, to not have seen this, what has happened. But anyway, Victor, thank you very, very much for joining us and discussing the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board's results, which came out, I think, end of last year. But you have probably most recent data. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Stefan. It's great to join this distinguished panel and follow Soumya. I'm going to give you a report on the GPMB. Came out in September, the end of September, not last year. It's very timely. But I also would link that to R&D, particularly ACT Accelerator, as part of the discussion that I'm sure Richard will bring up. Can I have first slide, please? So GPMB was founded in 2018 in response to a UN Secretary General High Commission that asked for an independent monitor of pandemic and was co-convened by WHO and the World Bank. And our first report, as you see here in 2019, we called it the world at risk. And we warned of a real threat of a rapidly spreading pandemic due to a lethal respiratory pathogen. As you can see that in fact, sadly, it happened. In that report, we called for 7 urgent actions, as you can see here. I won't have time to go over this, except to say government must act, countries must lead by example, they must build strong systems, there's got to be multilateralism, there has to be good financing, and UN must strengthen coordinating mechanism. Next slide. So sadly, we have now, as you said, midst of a pandemic with over 40 million people infected globally and over 1 million deaths. GPMB looked at what are the lessons learned, and I'll just simply go over this very quickly. First, COVID-19 has revealed a collective failure to take pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response seriously. And the world has not prioritized it. And in an interconnected world, it's a very frail system of multilateralism. We live in a world where we're so interconnected, a shock anywhere becomes catastrophic everywhere, as we see right now. And the impact on COVID-19 is well beyond health. It's an economic crisis. It's a social crisis. And in some places, it's a political crisis. And the current measurements of preparedness are not predictive. Using IHR or JEE or the Global Health Security Index, those countries perform best are actually some of them, like our countries, performing worst. And so this leads me to the third point, which is the human dimensions have been overlooked in many issues. Leadership for government has to be accountable and really look at ways by which you use science-based decisions. And that has not happened in many countries. That may account for some of the response failures. But certainly citizens have responsibility. It's very important they protect themselves, but each other. And the individualism has to be put aside and work together in protection of each other. So, because therefore, health emergency preparedness requires effective agile systems, a one health, all of society approach that's critically important. And pandemic is a common good. As we already said, how one country affects everybody, and we all must come together to work against it. Consequently, investment is key and return investment is immense, and we have not invested sufficiently in this world. And no one is safe until all are safe. So global preparedness is not simply the sum of national preparedness, it's actually solidarity, equity, and multilateralism. And of course, the world of pandemic preparedness is already complex. It needs, as I said, solid consolidation, but not further fragmentation. Next slide. So we came up with 5 recommendations: responsible leadership, engaged citizenship, robust global governance, sustained investment, and strong agile systems for health security. Next slide, please. I've summarized some of the key findings. By no means this is complete, but I want to emphasize a few important things. I've already said about the importance of responsible leadership. Key that country leaders and global leaders must use science-based decision and put away the polarization and politicization of the response. And the citizens must demand from their own country that kind of accountability, but themselves must participate and take responsibility to protect themselves and each other. Therefore, solidarity is critically important at all stages. Importantly is the governance of preparedness. I think we all recognize that agile needs to be relooked at and more accountability as a response to the World Health Assembly Amendment, but also mechanisms to addressing multi-sectoral preparedness in one all-of-society approach, in one health approach, where capacity, agility of the system are in fact well prepared. I think important in today's discussion is sustained investment. We looked at that countries must look at adequate financing for country response, but also we have to recognize preparedness as a global common good and should not be at the mercy of political economic cycles or just simply donor assistance. That there ought to be a mechanism to sustainable financing of global security, and including, as we will talk about today, vaccines, treatment, and diagnostic. It mobilizes resources in scale and in time, and not reliant on development financing as we are today. Next slide. And finally, strong agile systems. Strengthen WHO as an impartial international organization, but heads of government must renew their commitment to a multilateral system. We've observed way too much that governments are turning inward, looking at protecting the citizen, but not thinking about working together as a multilateral system. And the last point is critically important, which is all sectors, research, private, government, WHO, and international organizations must improve the coordination support for R&D in health emergencies and establish a sustainable mechanism to ensure the rapid development and equitable access to vaccines, diagnostic, therapeutics, and non-pharmacological interventions, PPE, oxygen, and others. Next slide. This leads me to pivot to 3 very important events that's happened globally. One is GPMB called for $8 billion of new funding for vaccines, drugs, and diagnostic. Secondly, that President von der Leyen of European Commission responded by hosting a coronavirus global response pledging event that raised $17 billion US. And third, the creation of access tools accelerator called ACT Accelerator. Next slide. And I'm going to finish very quickly by showing that because many of us, Soumya, myself, Richard, are involved with the accelerator, there are 3 pillars in a cross-cutting sector called health systems. The pillars are vaccine, therapeutics, diagnostic. It goes end to end, as Soumya said, from R&D, manufacturing, procurement, all the way to deployment. Next slide. And we have the fortune as unprecedented coming together of principles of CEPI, of Gavi, of WHO, of the Global Fund, of World Bank and others to work collectively together to solve this problem. Next slide. And my second last slide simply shows the goals of ACT Accelerator, which in fact is mobilizing 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of 2021, 245 million courses of therapeutics by mid-2021, and 500 million tests by mid-2021, with in fact health systems enabling PPE and oxygen, and of course access and location in equitable fashion to every country and everyone. Next slide. So the last slide simply says there are many challenges which we'll talk about. One, of course, is financing. To date, X-Accelerator is mainly dependent on donor development assistance and a donor assistance. And we need a sustainable financing. There's still a $30 to $35 billion gap to reach the goals of 2021. You have to coordinate, as Soumya said. How do you coordinate, deploy, and roll out all the scarce resources, not only vaccine, but diagnostic and therapeutics? How to ensure equitable distribution and public trust? And my final slide, please. This slide simply says governance and sustainable financing essential linkage at the center of this diagram that shows how interconnected many issues are. And I look forward to having the discussion with my fellow panelists on many of these very important issues. Thank you. Stefan, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Sorry for that. We will hear more about some of these approaches in more detail, I guess, mostly on the vaccines. I will later would like to bring up clearly also the preparedness in the sense of preventing that an outbreak does not turn into pandemic, and that is surveillance, as we tried to do it with the flu issues already, but we come back to that anyway. We have 3 questions now in the meantime, and they are all closely related to our later discussion. So I suggest that we move on now to our next presentation. Dr. Depal Liu from China will describe contributions of the Chinese Academy of Engineering in the fight against COVID-19. I would call this is the perspective from the Chinese Academy. Thank you, Dr. Liu.
Thank you for kind invitation for sharing the understanding of contributions of Chinese Academy of Engineering members in fighting against the COVID-19. And as you know, for the members of Chinese Academy of Engineering, we have of the...
You have to look, could you try to speak more into your microphone? Sorry, but it's a little bit difficult to understand.
Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Nearly 60 nearly 60 members from Chinese Academy of Engineering joined the following activities for the prevention and control strategies, analysis of the current situation, advice for disease diagnosis and for treatment, and infection control, vaccine and drug research and development, and also comprehensive analysis and scientific research. And the CAE members, especially Professor Nan Sanzhong, Professor Lan Juanli, Professor Peng Wang, and Professor Wei Chen, and so on, for medical treatments, countermeasures, and suggestions, developing effective drugs, improving nucleic acid detection ability, building an information monitoring and analysis system for personal mobility, and for establishing the Fangtang Shared Hospital and Yukon temporary hospitals, and for popular science books, for raising their voice through the media. Professor Nan Sanzhong mentioned the human-to-human transmission announcement. Professor Peng Wang for clinical study on the treatment of COVID-19 with Professor Xiaoping Ouyang for self-developed garbage collecting treatment equipment, and Professor Sao Yu for video monitoring platform for key epidemic control area, and Professor Zheng Hangzhou for crystal structure COVID-19 analysis, and so on. Next. And as you know, the Fountain Shield Hospital play very important roles in control pandemic. And the members from Chinese Academy of Engineering proposed the idea for treating mild ill patients, for addressing the pressing issues of virus transmission in communities, for cutting off the infection chain, for quickly transfer to design the high-level hospitals.
I'm sorry, Dr. Liu, you have to use more the microphone. I get from the audience, they have problems. You may, if you perhaps you switch off the video in between, sometimes that increases the audio.
Okay.
Didn't Professor Liu have
requests from the audience also?
To a higher level hospital. Okay. And the CAE set up the project on the drug research and development and the detection technology and equipment of protection and disinfection. For example, Professor Chen Jiangfeng and charging the regeneration and reuse of masks and reusable protective products against the COVID-19. Professor Lu Qihuang, coordination of clinical research and treatment. Professor Guo Yidang, Professor Lu Qihuang and Xi Wang and Liang Liu for traditional Chinese medicine, classified management, and centralized treatment. And especially for the hospital construction, for medical waste treatment, and for robust assistance to replace the medical staff in temporal inspection, disinfection, and temperature measurement, and diagnosis and treatment. And as you know, traditional Chinese medicine has played an important role in the fighting against the COVID-19. More than 100,000 people have traditional Chinese medicine. For infected in frontline hospitals with mild symptoms, and for providing treatment assistance to severely ill patients. And Chinese Academy of Engineering members not only did try their best, and also for international exchange and cooperation, for sharing China's best practices, for carrying out the technical training, for participating in international organizations, for example, IAP, and also demonstrating the unique role of TCM against the epidemic. And for example, Professor Nan Sanzong served as WHO committee expert. Also, Professor Nan Sanzong and Professor Chen Wang served as the IAP advisor committee co-members. Professor Chen Wang served as Lancet Epidemic Committee expert member. CAE has shared with the past Eurocase on Fountain Shield Hospital, as you know, the temporary hospital. And we are looking the future, Chinese academic engineering will continuously carry on medical treatment and R&D for controlling the pandemic. And the spirit of openness and sharing common solidarity against the COVID-19. Strengthen the communication and the exchange with the WHO, academies, medical institutions, and universities, and so on. Let's join together, try our best for benefiting human health. Thank you for your great attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very difficult to understand it all. I hope most people got the very important message from China. Thank you, Dr. Liu, and we will come back to several of the issues later. Let's now move on to a presentation from, if I may say so, Big Pharma, from Johnson & Johnson. Dr. Ruxandra Draghia-Akli, a major player in JJ is a major player both in vaccine and drug development, and you will discuss, Ruxandra, the impressive response of Johnson & Johnson to COVID-19. And
yes.
Slides, please, for her also. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel, some of whom I have worked with for many years. I have a personal story. I joined Johnson & Johnson to its global public health R&D organization early this year as the COVID-19 pandemic was emerging. And for those who don't know, GPH, so Global Public Health, is a fully dedicated end-to-end business within J&J, leveraging its internal capabilities while focusing on developing and delivering transformational medical innovation specifically to protect and treat underserved populations around the world, including in a pandemic like COVID-19. So if we can go to the next slide, please. When the outbreak hit, J&J was able to respond quickly and holistically, thanks to the work already underway to fight Ebola, HIV, and other global threats. Today, we are bringing to bear capabilities and are undertaking a multi-pronged response to COVID-19. We are, for instance, screening libraries of compounds, both ours and other companies' compounds, and conducting clinical trials to explore potential therapeutics. We are accelerating the clinical development of Janssen COVID-19 investigational vaccine candidate, leveraging the existing AdVac platform, while we are supporting the global response efforts with very scientifically robust technology solution and expanding our manufacturing and distribution capabilities to provide global access to Janssen COVID vaccine candidate as soon as early of 2021. If we can go to the next slide. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has emerged as the largest global health threat to humanity in this century, requiring the global scientific community to join forces in unprecedented ways. For instance, the Janssen pharmaceutical companies have a significant partnership with BARDA and with active NIH to progress R&D and human testing of its therapeutics and vaccine candidates. We are expanding our vaccine manufacturing capacity. So in addition to our existing capacity in Leiden in the Netherlands, we have also entered into agreements with Emergent Biosolutions and Catalan Biologics to support the manufacturing of our lead investigational COVID vaccine. We are also very excited to have launched the European Commission Innovative Medicine Initiative supported CARE Consortium and bringing together leading experts to urgently identify new medicines against SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses, while maximizing synergies and complementarities with other initiatives such as the Gates Foundation supported COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator, MANCO, or ECRAID to speed up the path to provide solutions to the current and future coronavirus outbreaks. If we can move to the next slide, and just very quickly show that this collaboration really entails tremendous amount of work and of partnership. So for instance, the CARE Consortium builds on 3 pillars: drug repurposing, small molecule drug discovery, screening and profiling of broad spectrum candidate compounds directed against coronavirus targets, as well as antibody discovery. As part of this initiative, as you can see on these slides, we are coordinating the overall program alongside Serum, the Vaccine Research Institute, and Takeda, and applying learnings from other ongoing collaborations that we had, for instance, with the Riga Institute of Medical Research, which is part of KU Leuven. If we can go to the next slide, moving from the partnerships to actually our vaccine efforts. You know very well that for more than 20 years, J&J has invested billions of dollars in antiviral and vaccine capabilities. Our COVID-19 vaccine program leverages Janssen-AdVac technology, the same technology which was used to develop our European Commission approved Ebola vaccine and used in the HIV, RSV, and Zika vaccine candidates. So we began our vaccine research efforts in January 2020, as soon as the sequence became available. In March, we've announced that a vaccine candidate has been identified, progressed into first in-human phase 1/2A clinical trials in July at sites in Belgium and the United States. And we have reported positive interim results from this clinical study, which have looked at the safety profile and immunogenicity after a single vaccination, and those were supportive of further development. If we can move to the next slide. There have been a lot of discussion in the last 6 to 8 months and about the inclusion of diverse populations in our clinical trials. And this is just a word to mention that Janssen-AdVac technology platform has been used to vaccinate more than 100,000 people across a number of investigational vaccine programs in diverse population and including adults, people over the age of 65, infants, children, HIV positive adults, and pregnant women, which suggests that this particular platform could be well correlated in the studied populations. If we can move to the next slide. Based on all this encouraging data, the company initiated the pivotal global phase 3 clinical trial. It's called Ensemble in September. This particular study will enroll up to 60,000 volunteers across 3 continents and will study the safety and efficacy of a single dose versus placebo in preventing COVID-19. In parallel, yes, the company is also developing other collaboration. I just want to mention that the J&J announced that it is preparing to resume the recruitment in the pivotal trial of its investigational vaccine in the United States after a temporary pause. The independent data safety and monitoring board overseeing the study has recommended the resuming the trial, and now in consultation with the FDA, they are preparation to resume the trial, including the submission for approval to the IRB. I know that I'm at time, so I just want to go to the next slide for one more minute. as Dr. Paul Stoffel mentioned in another panel this morning, once able to gather the necessary data for support for an approval for use, we are committed to making our COVID-19 vaccine accessible and to bringing to the public on a non-for-profit basis for the emergency pandemic use. And we are very happy to have signed a landmark communique on expanded global access. And that's it. I know the rest is on the slide. And I will be very happy to take questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for this overview. I may come back later. I'm still looking for some antivirals that come up. I mean, we talk mostly of vaccines, and that's also my major expertise, but I'm also urgently looking for antivirals, and remdesivir is not as strong as we had hoped for. Anyway, we come directly to a next presentation by Richard Hatchett, and I think this last sentence of giving 500 million doses from J&J is exactly what COVAX wants to do in an even broader scale. So thank you so much, Ruxandra, and let's come to Richard for the discussion of, I think you will focus on COVAX today. CEPI, together with Gavi and WHO, has established COVAX as a mechanism to provide vaccines for the world. And believe me, this is something I consider extremely important, and I'm also glad that this is going along the right way. Thank you. Richard.
Great, thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me okay? Okay. First, thanks to the organizers of the Global Health Summit and Professor Kaufman and Julian for organizing today's session. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here with my distinguished colleagues and good friends on the panel. Stefan, I'm actually going to speak both about COVAX and also about the specific role of CEPI in the fight against COVID-19. Obviously building on Victor's and Sumya's comments, and of course, Ruxandra, we welcome Alex Gorsky's commitment, and we are also working closely with our Chinese colleagues. I will just say that CEPI was set up to develop vaccines for epidemic diseases where there is a market failure, and one might argue that in a pandemic, there will be huge demand for vaccine, and that is very clearly true. And the capital markets will reward companies that successfully develop vaccines. And I think we've seen some evidence of that certainly along the way as companies have hit milestones and made public comments about their progress. But I would argue critically, and I think this is important for as we look to the future, that the market will still fail to meet global needs in a number of critical ways. The first is speed. The market will respond ultimately when it recognizes the challenge of the situation that it faces, but it may not respond fast enough. From January, when we recognized, based on our expertise and experience, that we were in a very serious situation, from January to early March, CEPI provided ignition capital for 9 projects, 8 of which, or 89%, are now in clinical trials, and 3, a third, are in phase 3. And I think it was important that we provided that early ignition capital and that we did that by selecting these candidates from a number of applicants that we've had that kind of success rate. For the 330 or so candidates that CEPI didn't fund, there are 36 other candidates, or 11%, that have reached clinical trials, and 7 or 2% of the global total in phase 3. And in fact, all of the candidates in phase 3, with only a single exception being Pfizer, have received substantial public sector funding from CEPI and other governments that are providing R&D funding. So I think that public sector financing is critically important to delivering vaccines at speed. The second area where markets will fail is equity. Left to its own devices, the market will fail poorer countries and leave the poorest behind. It is only through mechanisms like COVAX, and through using public sector funds to secure access and supply agreements, that we can overcome this inevitable and very real market failure. The third is that market mechanisms by themselves will not find the fastest path to ending the pandemic. Market mechanisms will not solve the problem of efficient distribution. And the final area where I think the market can potentially fail is looking ahead to future needs, to making sure we have the armamentarium we need for all populations in all geographies now, both now and for the future in which COVID-19 becomes endemic. In the near to midterm, the market will particularly reward those who are fastest to market, but it will not necessarily look ahead to those who best meet the needs of the world. So I think there's a very strong case for public sector financing, and we have targeted our investments to address all of these shortcomings, in fact. CEPI actually had previously allocated almost $140 million to developing vaccines against the closely related coronavirus MERS, and over $50 million to advancing vaccine platforms to respond rapidly to disease X, building on investments that the Gates Foundation, the US government, DARPA, and others had made in similar platforms in the past. We were able to redirect a majority of those partners to work on COVID-19, and they've all made very rapid progress, as I've described. For COVID-19, we built a deliberately diversified portfolio, both in terms of technology and geography, essentially backing a range of vaccine approaches so that we had more shots on goal, and as a hedge against the unpredictable risk of vaccine nationalism and the potential imposition of export controls. CEPI's priority in developing its vaccine portfolio was to achieve speed, scale, and ensure access. And we have expert teams actively managing that portfolio, continuously assessing opportunities, either to pare down or to expand or amend the portfolio to give us both the best possible chance of success in the near term and to make sure that we are meeting that need of serving all populations in all geographies now and in the future. To date, we have committed over $1 billion in support of COVID-19 vaccine development, supporting a wide range of activities, including clinical development of vaccine, production of clinical trial material, expansion of manufacturing capacity, technology transfer to globalized manufacturing, the establishment of a global laboratory network to provide standardized immune assessment of COVID-19 vaccines. We've provided critical support to GISAID to allow them to track the development of the virus. They've now published over 100,000 sequences from around the world. We've made investments to secure adequate supplies of medical glass and have placed capacity reservations for fill and finish capacity for up to 1 billion doses. These are all things that are going to be critically important to delivering vaccines quickly. Importantly, as I was saying, and I'm going to switch gears to talking about COVAX now, we have used these investments to secure capacity supply commitments for the COVAX facility, putting the COVAX facility first in line. And we first envisioned something like COVAX as a multilateral and cross-sectoral mechanism for the globally fair allocation of COVID-19 vaccines back at the end of March. And today, COVAX, the vaccine pillar of the ACT Accelerator, represents the world's most significant effort to promote vaccine multilateralism in the interest of ending the acute phase of the pandemic as quickly as possible. As you said, COVAX, and as Soumya has talked about and Victor's talked about, COVAX is co-led by CEPI, Gavi, and WHO. We're working closely with industry as a critical partner. It represents an end-to-end solution that is designed to accelerate vaccine development, increase the scale of manufacturing, and allocate vaccine equitably and proportionately to all participating countries. Our goal with COVAX is to minimize suffering and death, promote the restoration of normal economic activity around the world as quickly as possible, initially by making 2 billion doses of vaccine available by the end of next year. And we believe this would be sufficient to immunize healthcare workers in the most vulnerable segments of the population of each participating country, thereby hastening the end of the acute phase of the pandemic. As of today, 184 economies across all tiers of national income, all geographies, and representing greater than 90% of the world's population have signed up to participate. This is an extraordinary show of solidarity, all the more so if you take into account that COVAX was only formally established on May 4th, which is just over 5 months ago. Clearly, we have tremendous challenges ahead. We're still working to sort through challenges relating to labeling, how regulatory assessment can be harmonized, the need to develop mechanisms that address liability and compensation for potential vaccine injury, and of course, and most critically, preparing countries to receive and use vaccine in what will be the largest rollout of a new medical product in world history. Looking to the future, in conclusion, while COVAX may not be perfect, I do believe it and the ACT Accelerator within which it operates represent models for multi-sectoral collaboration that could become an important foundation of an improved global public health preparedness and response architecture. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very, very impressive. It reminds me of what Bill Gates once said, where is there no market, then market rules can't work. And that probably brings us directly to Trevor. And we will come back with many, many questions to you and all the others. So Trevor Mundell is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I don't need to say anything about BMGF in their impact on global health, but nevertheless, COVID-19 occurred, which is not blaming anybody. But Trevor, you will talk about global health equity to transform health for the future. And I guess you cover the broader picture in addition to COVID-19, which of course is of major focus today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and greetings to my fellow panelists, and thank you for your insightful comments. So I put up this the slide here, this transition from global health equity to transforming global health, because the point of departure that we had in this tragic circumstance was really around equitable access, so that these amazing tools that are being evolved, some of them starting to be deployed in wealthy countries, would be available and really accessible to communities around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. And that has been our singular focus throughout the last, I would say, 9 months. What has happened has been that I've seen a remarkable interaction between the public sector, the private sector, philanthropy, and some deals and collaborations emerged that I had never seen before in all my experience in global health. And I wanted to tell you about just 3 of those today. So if I could have the next slide. Here we go. And this is in the 3 domains: vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And let's start off with vaccines. So we've heard quite a bit today about vaccines. The particular concern here is that with the cost of these new vaccines, the speed of development, would these vaccines be accessible to lower middle income countries? And the multilateral mechanisms through COVAX, COVAX AMC, I think are exactly what are required to get that going. But it requires particular entities to come together and to partner. In this case, I wanted to talk about Gavi, which is an entity which is funded by the world's governments. Serum Institute of India, which is the largest volume producer of vaccines for Gavi and for lower middle income countries. And 2 companies, AstraZeneca and Novavax, a biotech company, AstraZeneca, a multinational company, that acquired rights to the one of the leading, certainly in terms of timing of potential introduction, the Oxford vaccine. And the collaboration that evolved over here was an agreement between the companies and Serum Institute that a substantial amount of the production that would be targeted to lower middle income countries for these 2 potential vaccines, Novavax vaccine, AstraZeneca, would come from Serum Institute of India. And the partnership was structured and developed through Gavi. We were able to provide some funding in the background to that effort. But one thing I must point out over here, this entire complex mixture of these entities getting together around this effort took about 6 weeks in effect to put together. And a complex situation like this, in any normal circumstance, I would have expected 12 to 18 months for such a enterprise to come together. So this was done remarkably quickly, to the point of being able to have the potential for providing these vaccines where they might be needed. On the therapeutics front, early on, it became clear that monoclonal antibodies might be an important therapeutic. And through the COVID Therapeutics Accelerator, which now is part of the ACT Accelerator Therapeutics workstream, we were able to acquire some capacity at Fujifilm, which is a antibody manufacturer, of about 20 batches, which, depending on the dose, might be able to produce a couple of million doses, maybe 3 to 4 million doses in a year of monoclonal antibodies. At a time when there was a tremendous pressure on the capacity for antibody production as people became aware of the need and the potential of antibodies. And then there was the effort of having this capacity, what antibodies would be put into the capacity, developed over there. And there were a couple of leading companies over here. AstraZeneca was involved, Eli Lilly, Regeneron, biotech called Vir, all had antibody programs. And what I saw over there between the group with these leading antibody programs was a tremendous spirit actually of participation with us, in a sense of, let's look across a number of parameters, and let's find the antibody with the best characteristics that could go into this precious capacity that could be utilized for lower middle income countries. And I really haven't seen that spirit of collaboration between fierce competitors within the commercial markets before. Ultimately, we selected the Lilly antibodies to go into this capacity, and we're now in the process of tech transferring these antibodies. So this would be the first time ever that antibodies potentially could be used broadly within lower middle income countries. And I think it's going to be an important and very substantial effort to understand how that's going to be done. But the fact of having that opportunity, I think, is quite remarkable. On the diagnostics front, I just want to talk a little bit about a diagnostics company, a private company, Lumira, that has got a very novel platform, a very accurate test across a broad range of global health assays of interest that we had been working with for some years in terms of introducing the platform, particularly into sub-Saharan Africa. But they developed a COVID diagnostic, an antigen and an antibody diagnostic, which is quite accurate, actually. And now this is still in evolution, working with the diagnostics workstream of the ACTA Accelerator, for instance, an effort to put this device into sub-Saharan Africa for diagnosis. But there's behind this another ambition, which is, could this actually accelerate the introduction of a platform like this? And could we get this more broadly deployed so that beyond just COVID, it could be used for a variety of global health issues? And most ambitiously, can we do in 2 years what we had really planned over 5 years plus in terms of having this platform distributed? Maybe I can turn to my final slide. With these examples of remarkable partnership across sectors, I think that we can start to think about this new framework for global health equity. And I would be interested in the participants in the World Health Summit, the panelists over here, to get your ideas. What should we now require as the new normal framework that really is a right and a starting point for going forward in global health? Not turning back to February of 2020, but looking forward out of this tragedy, what opportunities can we elicit and can we move forward with? So for instance, should it not be the case that a sustainable oxygen supply should be in almost every hospital in sub-Saharan Africa? And that is already in progress for COVID. Can we be using that to treat the many premature infants that are born that don't have oxygen accessibility? What about the digital frameworks that are evolving very rapidly over here? Should it not be the case that every diagnostic we deploy is within a digital framework, so you know who did it, to whom, and what the outcome was? It's happening now for COVID, but this can happen for many of those slow-moving epidemics that we have in the background: malaria, HIV, tuberculosis. And what about surveillance, molecular surveillance? Should that not be broadly accessible as well, as we have for COVID? Could we not then, with the infrastructure that is put in place, turn that, once we've dealt with the acute phase, to these other problems? As I've mentioned, this is malaria, this is TB, and this is HIV, and a number of other issues that face us in these geographies. So I see the tragedy and I see the opportunity, and I think that this new framework is essential for us to really take a step change now in global health equity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Trevor, for this kind of concluding remarks, I would almost say. There are a number of questions from the audience. I read them, but I have to be reading them partly again. Some were just asking for slides, and I guess best is to contact the speakers if you get the slides, or perhaps they are also on the World Health Summit where you can find them. So I will not deal with these questions in particular. You have to approach the owners of the slides more or less. The first part of, actually most of the questions go into vaccines, the value of vaccines, or the disvalue, and perhaps we start with these kind of questions that deal with the current situation. And there is some Carmen Pound question for Lady Carmen Pound. She asked, will the CEPI portfolio expand beyond the vaccines it includes right now? And would COVAX also include vaccines that are not part of CEPI, some of the Russia and China made vaccines? That's a very specific question, I guess, to Richard. Also, Soumya may also respond to those, or everybody. So I pass it over to you, Richard.
Great, thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Carmen, for the question. So CEPI is continuing to look very selectively at possible new investments if we think that the vaccines could fill what we view as an important gap in the armamentarium, or that would allow for significant improvements within a promising platform technology. So, but we obviously depend on the resources that governments entrust to us, and we have to be very, very selective about our investments at this point. COVAX, however, is very consciously and deliberately looking at the entire range of vaccines that are being developed globally. So there is no limitation of the vaccines that will be represented in COVAX to the vaccines that CEPI has supported, and we have set up mechanisms to allow for independent review of potential candidates. UNICEF, is issuing a call for information for potential vaccines for consideration for inclusion in COVAX. And obviously, to assemble a portfolio of vaccines that could deliver 2 billion vaccines next year, we're going to have to draw on a number of different candidates. And those could certainly include, you mentioned in your question, the vaccine from Gamaleya in Russia, and the many Chinese candidates that are currently in phase 3, and those absolutely would be eligible for review. I don't know if Soumya wants to add anything to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Soumya, you want to comment on this? If not,
I could add something on the allocation, because I saw some questions on how these vaccines are going to be equitably distributed. And so that's one of the goals of COVAX, as Richard mentioned. It's not just speeding up the development, ensuring that there is investment in manufacturing capacity well in advance of even the results of phase 3 trials coming out, so that we can shorten the time between the phase 3 trial and the availability of vaccine. But most importantly, to ensure this, to make sure that people in all parts of the world, in different countries, at least the highest risk groups, get access to the vaccine. So WHO has worked with partners and our member states and stakeholders on what we call an allocation framework that essentially looks at the first year of limited supplies. We know that supplies will be limited. And how do you distribute it fairly? And there are certain ethical principles on which this allocation framework is based, basically saying that the people who are at highest risk, the most vulnerable, both in terms of getting infection and in terms of falling ill, and we've seen that health workers are certainly in that category, followed by older people and those who have underlying illnesses, should be first in line to get when the vaccine is in short supply. And subsequently from 2022 onwards, when more vaccine is available, then the situation is likely to allow larger parts of the population to get vaccination. So the COVAX facility now has a governance mechanism. It will have an independent body that looks at allocation. There will be recommendations made by an institutional expert group, and then that will be vetted by another group. So lots of mechanisms being put in place to ensure that countries actually get the vaccines as soon as possible and they get it in a fair way. We're also working with countries to ensure that they can then receive and deploy the vaccines quickly, because there are a lot of things that countries need to do to prepare for the deployment of these. Are adult vaccines, so most of them are going to need 2 doses. They're going to need cold chain. They're going to need a lot of training of healthcare workers. So those are all things we are working, with the partners of the Gavi Alliance, as well as the World Bank, that has also invested, has made available $12 billion for countries to use, not just for vaccines, but also for drugs and diagnostics.
Yeah. So let's just ask Rusandra, can I ask you to clarify the 500 million that J&J is offering for low-income countries, if I understood that last slide of yours? Is that in addition, and how much independent or interconnected is that with COVAX? And similarly then to Trevor, what's the situation with the Serum Institute India and the AstraZeneca? Is that outside of the COVAX program? Is that additional? So we focus now on supply of vaccines to low-income countries, and you may have to unmute if you want to say something, Ruxandra. Not only you may have, you have to.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just trying to find the button. So in fact, we are in discussions with COVAX to ask to see where and how the vaccine is going to be available. But of course, this is a commitment that will be dedicated to these resource-limited settings from our company. I hope that that answers. So how exactly, it's still under discussion.
Yep. So Trevor, you want to comment on
Yes.
the Serum Institute issue?
Yes, no, absolutely. That is very much part of the COVAX facility, the AMC part of the COVAX facility.
So the 2 billion will not be sufficient, obviously. I understood that and read it from the COVAX before, and it's about 2 billion. It's for those who need it most. Let me just simplify the term. But of course, all other efforts will also be that everybody who wants it will get it also, hopefully in the next times. But there might be then a kind of grading between high-income countries and low-income countries and the kind of national. I don't know whether Trevor or Victor wants to comment on that.
Stefan, I'd like to comment on what Soumya said, which is really important.
Yes.
And it's reflected in my last slide, which is once you have an allocation framework, as WHO has,
yes,
and National Academy has also done an allocation framework that's very similar, actually the deployment is going to be a lot trickier because most sovereign countries are going to determine how they can follow the framework, but they have to distribute and administer this, which means that it actually requires a large amount of coordination and resources. And that's where the World Bank $12 billion is helpful, because so much of it is focused on the development and the manufacturing procurement. But I think the last mile has to be really administered properly. And this is not a small task whatsoever. I just want to emphasize what Soumya said. I also thought that Trevor's idea of reframing global health is really, really important. If I can just kind of chime in, if you will. I mean, first of all, I think our global health outlook today is very much global north as helping Global South, as what some people would call a colonial approach. I think that eventually we need to look at a much more distributed approach of a framework. But importantly, sustainability requires governance framework, which is very difficult. I do think Accelerator has provided a very good model, but Accelerator was formed for 2 years with a light touch management model. And of course, ultimately, how do you bring all these principles together to continue to work together, particularly after COVID, is a critically important issue. And of course, financing is the other one. How do you create sustainable financing where most of the dollars coming to ACT Accelerator is really from donations and development assistance? And so I think, Trevor, to reach those goals, which I totally support, we're going to have to work on those issues. Now, GPMB is probably going to do a commissioned study in these areas, and Jeremy Farrar and I are leading many of this effort. Would love to, I've talked to Chris Elias about this too, Trevor, and of course, would love to work with all of you, Soumya, Richard, and others. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments? Trevor?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Victor. And, we certainly welcome the participation in this effort going forward. Just getting back to the 2 billion, Stefan, and your question around, is this really enough? And understanding that it's going to be targeted to the high-risk individuals. I think that in the rosy scenario where many of the vaccines work, we do have this line of sight, Richard is very involved with this, to about these 2 billion doses. Now, this is by the end of 2021. And I think, as Victor and others have made the comment, having these 2 billion doses is going to challenge the delivery system. So I think we already would be taxing the systems for delivery with that number if that is all realized. I think one of the efforts around COVAX and CEPI have been to really expand the accessible number of doses. So I think that could expand greatly beyond 2021. There will have to be the payment determined how exactly that's going to be paid for. But I do think that post 2021, if successful with delivery of the first 2 billion, if that turns out to be practical, then we have the potential for great expansion because we do have the ambition that everybody should have access to the vaccines.
Yeah. We will mostly focus today probably on the medical interventions, but I have one question by Sonia Diaz-Monsalve, probably to Soumya mostly. What are the WHO recommendations for the severe social and economic impact in LMICs, in low middle income countries, more or less? And I think that is an important issue actually. And perhaps some of you, at least Soumya, want to briefly answer to this request.
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue. And this is why WHO has been saying that the measures that countries need to take should be based on a locally contextual, data-driven approach, targeting the virus and going after the virus, and not these so-called lockdowns, which in the beginning many countries had to do because there wasn't enough diagnostics, they could not put in place the systems, there was no time. And so countries went into these lockdowns with severe restrictive measures. But as we are now, 10 months into the pandemic, the idea was that health systems should have been prepared by now. We're seeing this huge second wave in Europe, for example, with many countries again struggling with hospitals getting full and so on. And so it's very difficult especially for the low-income countries. So we've put out quite a lot of guidance on how to safely reopen schools and education institutions, offices, workplaces, recognizing you can't keep these places closed, and also giving guidance on how to track where the infections are spreading and how to take action on that. And lastly, on how to keep health systems running. Because what has happened is that everything was repurposed to deal with COVID, and now that there's data coming out on excess mortality from many countries, a lot of excess mortality due to diseases other than COVID. And this is going to become more and more obvious as the data starts coming in. So people with chronic diseases, maternal and child illnesses, other infectious diseases, all of these need to be taken care of. So it is difficult, and it's hard to do all of this if the health system is not prepared. And that is why I think the Preparedness Board is really talking about, at least for the next time around, we should invest. And as Dr. Tedros says, we go through cycles of neglect and panic. There's all of this panic, but the moment we are out of this crisis, hopefully we don't go back into a cycle of neglect. And I think Trevor's point about what are the lessons we can learn from this pandemic to ensure there's product development for other diseases of huge public health importance. We should be able to learn, the way we've been able to work cooperatively across the public and private sectors to deal with this pandemic. There's no reason why we can't do it for other diseases, especially when there's a lot of public interest.
There are so many other questions coming up. Most of them are specific. One of the last very specific or more specific question, perhaps, I don't know, Richard, Ruxandra, whoever goes, we heard a lot about vaccines, yes, and everybody hopes that they're coming. But there are, of course, and Trevor mentioned that there are also drugs and diagnostics that can be improved. We know dexamethasone is a very old drug that does something. Antivirals, are there more than remdesivir in the pipeline? I hear very little about it. And antibodies, of course, are good, but they will be an expensive enterprise, even with support. So is there anybody who can comment on the antivirals?
So I can take a stab and then turn to the others. I think that one entity cannot respond or really be specialized in every single aspect of responding to an epidemic and to a pandemic. And one of the lessons of every epidemic was that we really need to work in collaboration, in cooperation, in partnership in order to tackle these issues. And as I have been mentioning, and the activities all across the world have shown that putting in place these consortia that will be starting, for instance, with SARS-CoV-2, they will move to other coronaviruses, but then they might in the future address this element of pandemic preparedness are really essential. And for instance, our efforts around antivirals, and I'm talking also a little bit on behalf of everyone here on the call, have started with trying to repurpose existing drugs. A lot of efforts, many libraries of compounds have been put together, screened, but as the time is evolving and results are coming in, our investigations are going to be obviously heading in other directions. So
I have to interrupt you now, sorry for that, because I would like to ask every panelist one or two last questions. You only have 1 minute, so you may choose whatever you think. For me, it's probably, I would like to know what you consider the real important next steps for it. What's the situation with either this one or another one? And that is, what is the situation with all these other hidden pandemics or whatever you want to call it, HIV, malaria, TB? We know that notifications go down, drug treatment is reduced. And what can we learn from the crisis? So this is a kind of a complex situation. I go just from my screen, start with Richard.
Great, thank you, Stefan.
You only have a minute because I'm told you have to finish in time. Sorry for that.
Very good suggestion. As you know, on October 8th, China and Delhi, the vaccine alliance signed by agreement officially joining COVAX. This is a very important step China has taken. As you know, currently the COVID-19 pandemic still possesses a serious threat to the safety and the health of people in all countries in the world. China continues to focus on ensuring that developing countries have equal access to appropriate, safe, and effective vaccines. So China will also strengthen vaccine cooperation with relevant countries through the COVAX network. We will continue to work together with COVAX parties and contribute our share on the global fight against the pandemic to safeguard to human beings' safety and health. And the second suggestion, what we learned in this pandemic, I think the most important of putting people first. The people's health and life are very, very important. The United Nations, WHO, every country, the scientists, the society, the medical field, all should realize.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have to rush through it now. Richard as the next one. Thank you, Dr. Liu. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Liu. And your final comment about putting people first, critically important. I'll just say the key lesson that I hope decision makers will take away from this pandemic, it doesn't address the hidden pandemics that you asked about, but is that epidemics and pandemics represent a systemic constitutive risk of the world that we now live in. And they have ignored for too long the risk of a pandemic. We've all said this is unprecedented. I like to add, but it was not unanticipated. And we do need to come together to develop the mechanisms, particularly the financing, to build a better global system of preparedness and response. Thanks.
And we'd always be a bargain. Trevor.
Yes, I just come back again to let's capture the passion and the urgency of this COVID response to build this new framework, which we desperately need for all of global health. Thank you.
Thank you. Soumya, you have to unmute. And then Victor, you have to unmute also afterwards. Soumya.
Yeah, I think for me, two things. One is collaboration across public, private sector, governments, agencies in research and development, including clinical trials and moving products very rapidly through the process. The second, I think, is there's been a lot of innovation now that's coming forward. I think Trevor mentioned oxygen systems. We've been working with Sudan and Somalia to put in place some solar-powered oxygen manufacturing systems and so on. There are a lot of contact tracing apps. Why can't we use some of these for diseases like tuberculosis, to do contact tracing that we failed in actually for many, many years. So I think we can see what are the innovations that we've used in COVID that could be applied. And I think genetic sequence sharing platforms, Richard mentioned GISAID. I really think we need to expand that to many other pathogens because it's proven its utility and usefulness.
Thank you. And last not least, Victor.
Well, I think innovation is absolutely important because we're not for innovation. We won't have a diagnostic therapeutics system innovation. So that's key. But innovation has to be developed in the context of strategy and coordination. Hence, my point is multilateralism, solidarity, and equity. And finally, the issue of sustainability. What Trevor pointed out is so important. Until we can create a framework that's sustainable, financing or governance, getting people working together, we can have all the innovations in the world, it will not work.
Thank you. I think most of the audience and the panelists, at least myself, also agree with all these comments. Let's hope that some people who could change that and need to change that would also listen to these comments. So thank you so much for all your thoughtful comments. I thought it was an outstanding, excellent round of discussions. I apologize to the audience that we could not cover all your questions, but maybe that some of the panelists answer them by typing in, if that is still possible. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly is not over, and it's far from over, in my opinion. But at least what we heard today gives me a glimmer of hope, and I hope all agree on that as well. So thanks very much. We are just in time, but we have to finish now. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.